We're talking today with Mark Northrup of Hudsonville, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay. So Mark, begin with a little bit of background on yourself, and to start with, where and when were you born?
I was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 1957, November.
Okay. And did you grow up there?
So predominantly my father was an Air Force officer, so I grew up as what we call a military brat quite often. My father retired out of the Air Force when I was about 12 years old. We were living in Colorado. We had done a tour in Naples, Italy. So my whole formative years were all around military officers, predominantly Air Force and Navy. My father was obviously a very good pilot and officer. He flew B-17s during World War II. My older brother, by 10 years, Colonel Craig Northrup, went off to the Air Force Academy in 1966 and was commissioned out of the Air Force Academy in I want to say 1970. So that'd be 1970 he was commissioned. And my older brother flew C-141s transports and flew combat missions into Vietnam as Saigon fell. So my formative years, I had an opportunity to go to Navy ROTC. I chose instead to go to a liberal arts college in Minnesota. I always knew I wanted to be a military officer at some point in my career. So I turned down a ROTC scholarship and went on to a liberal arts school. You have to remember, in the late 70s, it was not very appealing in the public eye, particularly living in a state like Minnesota, which is very liberal. There was, in those days, you probably recall, there was a lot of disdain for the military and people that wore the uniform. There's been a change in the culture and respect for those in the military. Maybe some was earned out of the Vietnam fallout, but I think nowadays there's a genuine appreciation for those that serve. You know, when you and I were children, over half the adults, men, were veterans. Nowadays, it's maybe 7% and falling fast because the military is just a much more efficient and a smaller organization, and not as many people go into the service for 1 year, or they don't have conscripts. We have professional soldiers and sailors and airmen. Yeah. So it's changed a lot. So when I graduated from college, I knew I wanted to be a military officer.
Okay. Just to back up a little bit, when did you start college?
That would have been in 1975. I graduated from high school.
Okay. And what college did you go to?
St. Olaf College in Minnesota. Okay. It's a small liberal arts college, predominantly Lutheran. I enjoyed the college, but obviously it's not what I would categorize a bastion of militarism. When I announced to my college roommates I was interested in joining the service and going to an OCS program, quite frankly, I was held in some disdain. But quite frankly, I didn't care because I had my father and brother to look up to in their service into our country.
Okay. So how did you wind up choosing the Coast Guard?
Well, I had a 4-year OCS commitment with the Navy to be an ASW officer and a surface warfare officer. would have been a great career in the Navy, but the commitment was 4 years, and I did a little bit of research and found out the Coast Guard had a smaller organization, and the commitment would have been 3 years. So I just thought that if this is something not a good fit for me, a year could be a long time. Also, you have to admit that the mission of the Coast Guard is much different than the mission of the other armed services. So that appealed to me, particularly growing up in a state like Minnesota, which was maybe a little more altruistic. So it was an opportunity to maybe realize I could have an opportunity to do pollution and cleanups and search and rescue and those kind of missions.
Okay. All right. So what's the process now to get you into the Coast Guard?
So I did an application, and I was selected to go to an OCS program in Yorktown, Virginia. I was a commissioned reserve officer. I went in November of 1980, and I was commissioned in March of 1981. It was a 19-week program. I was commissioned, and following the commission on my duty assignment was a old Coast Guard icebreaking buoy tender out of Duluth, Minnesota. Okay. So I actually kind of had an opportunity to go back home and serve on a ship or a cutter in my hometown.
So let's back up again. Describe the training process. What do you do at Yorktown?
Well, there are 4 elements: leadership, seamanship, history, and navigation. I didn't have a problem with any one of those other than just trying to learn what it was to be a military officer. 19 weeks is a long time. Roughly half the class were prior enlisted. There was, at that time, there was really looking to pull high performers in the enlisted ranks to be officers. So the top half of the class was all the enlisted, ex-enlisted guys. And I fell right in the middle, so I was, I guess, probably pretty well on the top for my, for the regulars, the reserves that came in from the outside.
As far as you could tell, did the Coast Guard have a hard time recruiting people in those days, or were there plenty
Not
of
really.
people?
No, we, you know, the Coast Guard's always been held in some high regard within within the communities it serves, and has maybe a little bit of a different reputation. We never had a problem serving, getting enough people to serve on our ships, quality people, and it still holds true to this day that the Coast Guard typically can be very, very selective. And I was very privileged that I got to be selected to be a Coast Guard officer.
Okay. Now, I remember once interviewing somebody who was Coast Guard enlisted, and he talked about some of the physical training that he got, and the amount of being thrown into water and a lot of other stuff. I mean, did you do much training?
Yeah, I
that was
mean,
connected to
we did some, you know, obviously there's physical fitness training. I personally never had any problems. I was an athlete in high school, and when I went off to OCS, I was in fine shape already, and actually found that the physical fitness side was probably the easiest part of OCS for me personally. But you could tell those that hadn't maybe had that opportunity to be physically fit struggled more. I always felt kind of bad for them, but you know, that's the reality. When you go off to indoctrination, it's predicated that you need to get trained before you go, else you're going to struggle. I mean, I think that holds true even today, particularly with the level of obesity we're seeing in the current population.
Right.
But in terms of the physical fitness, you know, swimming, I think I was #1 in the class for swimming. Running, I was very at the top. So in terms of my athletic prowess and physical fitness, I didn't find it to be a challenge.
Okay. Now, did they do much to kind of exercises that kind of simulated rescues at sea or things like
Well,
that?
we did one tour on we did an OCS cruise on an old Coast Guard cutter called the Unimac. It was a World War II seagoing plane tender that was a hand down from the Navy. It was a tug, very, very large, 200-foot tug. So we did deploy on that for 10 days, went down into the Caribbean. Incidentally, we did a large marijuana bust, did a seizure. So from the standpoint of my first opportunity to go to sea with the Coast Guard, it was kind of exciting to be involved in a major drug bust. So yeah, but most of it was academics in the classroom, celestial navigation, basic navigation, basic seamanship skills. It was more academic book learning than it was hands-on, so to speak, except for the cruise we went on when we went down to the Caribbean.
Okay, so we kind of get you through that. Now pick up your story again.
So in April of 1981, I reported to duty on a Coast Guard cutter in Duluth, Minnesota. It was a World War II icebreaking buoy tender. It would be the least glamorous ship a person could serve on. It is a working ship. You know, you talk about Mike Rowe. In fact, Mike Rowe did a segment on dirty jobs for buoy tenders, because by virtue of the mission, working aids navigation and a slow, black, kind of ugly old World War II tug is not glamorous work. It's hard, laborious, arduous work for not just the enlisted, but for the officers too. Lake Superior in those days, you know, we struggled with fog and heavy weather, and there's more than one occasion where we touched bottom, as we would say, kissed the bottom, by virtue of the fact of our mission, working aids navigation, lighthouses. We did some other work with the University of Minnesota doing core samples throughout Lake Superior in regards to taconite tailings that have been dumped out of Silver Bay for the steel industry. We did several other missions for fisheries. We did some fish stocking programs. So it was a multi-mission kind of ship that we would relish any opportunity to service our community, in addition to putting out our buoys and servicing the aids navigation. You know, Jim, you know, people see lighthouses as glamorous, kind of cool places. You know, and I served in Alaska too on a buoy tender, and they are. But from my perspective, when I see a lighthouse, I see a cold, damp facility that needs extensive maintenance, that's full of bird guano and is labor intensive and expensive to maintain. And quite frankly, there's really nothing glamorous about bird guano and cold, damp brick buildings. But when you're on a boat and you're looking to the shore and you see that wonderful light, it warms the heart. But my perspective perhaps is a little bit different.
Right.
Some of that glamour or romance it leaves you when you're there. There's no romance in it.
Yeah, it becomes something to clean
Yes.
rather than something.
Clean and
okay.
paint.
Now, how big was the boat?
180 feet.
Okay. And how large was the crew?
65. We had a crew of 7 officers and roughly 55 to 60 enlisted.
Okay. And what sort of reception do you get when you arrive?
Well, this is common throughout the service. When you show up, you're considered a butter bar. You're right out of OCS. You're recently commissioned, whether you come from an OCS program or a ROTC program, or you come from the Coast Guard Academy. And there is a learning period to understand. You maybe have authority over people, but you don't have abilities. And there's a learning curve for that young officer to understand that, it's a participative leadership style. Yes, I have to make decisions. Yes, I have the education, but you and I are a team. We're not adversarial. And when you get in those situations where it is adversarial, it damages the crew, it damages the mission, and it damages the people. So I was always very aware to be considerate and thoughtful for my enlisted crew. I was always blessed. I always had great people working for me. And in fact, to this day, sometimes I still get reach out from some old crew member that remembers some event, and he'll reach out to me, which kind of warms the heart. But there was never anything adversarial with my crew.
So what kind of duties did you have when you started out? When you get the new guy, what does the new guy do?
Well, I mean, for the first couple months, as you would expect, you draw out every ship's infrastructure, the water, the piping, standing watches in the engine room, the bridge, working on the deck, learning all the deck gear. So as an officer, you became multi-talented across all disciplines of the ship, starting the mains of the engines, light off, running the deck gear, launching boats, navigating the ship, driving the ship. All those responsibilities the first few months. It takes roughly 4 months to qualify as I would call a underway OOD officer of the deck. I didn't have any problem with that because I thought it was fun. It's drawing everything out in the ship, and then the more seasoned officers and the captain would hold a board and would review you, and you had to perform and be able to intellectually spill it out and be articulate. And if you didn't qualify. And if you didn't qualify, you couldn't stand watch. If you couldn't stand watch, your life was miserable if you weren't qualified. So I had no problem. I was single and I loved the ship. I stayed on the ship. My first 6 months, it was my home, and I relished the opportunity to serve on a ship that had a great mission. And one of the advantages we had on Lake Superior and in the Great Lakes is the ships did not rust. So a ship that was built in 1945 and 1981 was pristine. We had no rust. And the engines were near new, even though we had to do maintenance on them. The point was, though, that if you don't live in that, work in the environment where there's salt water or you're in dirty water, ships will last forever. I mean, as evidenced by, several of the ships still serving on the Great Lakes, are 70, 80 years old still.
Okay. So it's really the absence of salt as much as anything else that makes a difference
Salt,
for that.
you betcha.
Okay. Now, what were the officers on that ship like?
Well, they were my brothers. We drank, we partied, we sailed, we stayed up all night, we drove the ship, we broke ice, we worked buoys. They were my brothers, they were my friends, and I'm still in touch with some of them from, now approaching nearly 40 years later. There's that brotherhood of a crew, particularly with the officers you've served with. I mean, you might not think you went to war, but when you're working really in harsh climates and often, as you can imagine, in the severe weather we worked and where our buoys, our aids and navigations were, it was dangerous work. I'm not going to deny there was a pucker factor. And more than once, you realize that by the grace of God, you lived. And because of those events, you gain that real sense of duty and loyalty to your peers and your brothers.
Sure. Are there particular incidents from that 6-month tour that kind of stand out?
Well, it was took about 4 months for me to qualify.
Yeah.
The tour on the ship, I stayed 2.5 years.
Okay, so 2.5 years, okay.
One event that I recall, I was third in command. My executive officer was took vacation, so I was the acting executive officer. We came out of Duluth, it was November, and we came out of Duluth, got on the Lake Carrier Association tracks, went northeast to the Keweenaw Peninsula, where we staged aids navigation, buoys, and sinkers. We went down the track and we turned right to go into the Keweenaw waterway. Obviously the the days were short, and when we made our right-hand turn to line up to go into the Keweenaw waterway, the sea swell got to be maybe 45 feet. The ship rolled to 45 degrees. It hung there hard. I was driving the ship. The captain was on the bridge. And at the last minute, the captain said, "Mark, do you have the inner bay lights?" And I said, "Captain, I don't see the outer bay lights unless we come out of the surf," because the ship was rolling and the swell was so severe. And at the last minute, he said, "Mark, come right." Basically saying, "We abort, let's go home." And I'll never get those words. I live them every day. Helmsman right, full rudder, all ahead full. And we aborted our approach into the Keweenaw waterway in some really terrible storms. Incidentally, it was on the anniversary of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Okay.
You didn't think about that at the moment, but in retrospect, you begin to understand why that ship sank on that, not on that particular night, but a few years earlier. It would have been 6 years earlier. So that's a little bit sobering. I recall then about 2 weeks later, we had a Christmas party for the crew in the basement of a Chinese restaurant downtown Duluth. And the captain was a little bit stoic. He was, he rode my ass. He rode my ass hard, mostly because he knew if he did, I got stuff done for the ship. And he got up and gave a speech. I thought I was going to get my ass handed to me. And he gave a speech to the crew and the wives and our families. And he talked about how the grace of God was with us that night. And we get to live for another day. So I have a few other events like that in my career, but that's one that really stands out, because particularly as a young junior officer with maybe only a year of active duty, you begin to really realize that the lives of your crew and of a ship, a national asset, is your responsibility and yours alone, and your decisions can make or break and save lives or kill people.
Okay. Now, while you were in Duluth, were there any? Did you actually rescue people, or?
We had a couple of rescue events. One in particular, there's a lighthouse that stands out in the middle of Lake Superior called Standard Rock. We were underway, and there was a float plane reported overdue. I immediately started to do search and rescue techniques, drawing out a pattern, but as was the case, the lake was full in fog. We were stranded off Standard Rock because that was the last location of the plane. And the captain made the observation that the Standard Rock sound signal was not activated. And I said, "Well, Captain, that's fine, but we need to start a search pattern." He said, "No, I think we need to reactivate the light and send a boat to the light and get the sound signal fixed." So I launched a motor cargo boat. Was vectoring him in with the radar because obviously they couldn't see, and he was about 20 yards off the light, and I immediately heard over the radio him backing hard and hitting something, which made no sense. These gentlemen had taken their float plane and they had tied it up to Standard Rock, and they had broken into the light, and their float plane had been damaged, and one of the floats was punctured, and the plane sank right there at the lighthouse. And they were marooned, so to speak, in the lighthouse, in a cold, damp lighthouse. So we rescued them, and subsequently, I don't know what ever happened to the plane, but I do know that I had to provide a deposition because they claimed that we had damaged the plane, and it wasn't of their own malfeasance. So that was just one example of one event that always kind of stands out. That search and rescue events typically are because people do dumb stuff, and not that they deserve it, but that would be a classic example. But they were pretty glad to see us coming out of the fog to rescue them.
Yeah, and the captain's instinct was kind of accidentally pretty good.
Yes. Another lesson learned.
All right. Okay. Other things you want to bring in about the stay in Duluth before you move on?
Duluth it's just a wonderful old port town. I met my wife there. It will always be a special place for me, for the obvious reason my wife is from there. It's a wonderful place. It's cold though. You know, we broke ice. We broke ice into the channel coming into Duluth. It has a wonderful aerial lift bridge. It's just a really cool town to drive a ship and break ice and work buoys. I can't express it any other way. My parents came to see me right when I was courting my wife, and unfortunately it was a weekend, and the mid-channel marker had been run over in Duluth, and so we spent the whole weekend driving the ship back and forth with the grappling hooks trying to find the buoy and rescue the buoy that had been driven into the mud. My parents were on shore with my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, and somebody came up and said, "What's the Coast Guard doing out there?" And my father said, "Well, they're looking for a buoy that got hit." Well, they didn't hear buoy, they heard boy.
Oh.
So obviously we weren't looking for a boy that had been run over and drowned and pushed into the mud. So we did recover the buoy, and we did rescue it, but it was obviously, as you can imagine, there was some seamanship and line handling efforts to recover that buoy that had been driven into the mud. They call it a Morse alpha because it blinks alpha in terms of the Morse code. It marks the middle of the channel.
Okay. Now, when you had enlisted, part of the reason why you picked the Coast Guard was you'd only have to be there for 3 years. And so you go through 2.5 years in Duluth, that hitches up. But you wind up staying in the Coast Guard quite a while.
Yeah, I realized I liked it. I liked the camaraderie. I liked the mission. The skipper liked me in spite of the fact he was a real driver. Mm-hmm. He was a no-nonsense, hard-nosed, foul-mouthed, hard-drinking guy. Mm-hmm. And he could ride my you-know-what, and he was ex-enlisted. When he took command of the ship, I remember he mustered the crew and gathered them all around and said, "Men, I looked at all your service records, and I want you to know here and now, I am your old man." Mm-hmm. Now, you don't call the captain the old man to his face, obviously, but he was acknowledging the fact, I am the oldest in the crew, I'm ex-enlisted, I know what you're all about, and I'm going to be a good captain for this ship. And in fact, he was. So here again, that was kind of a lesson learned about leadership and acknowledging who you are to your crew. He liked me, and I screened to have a command of a long-range navigation station in Japan, Okinawa. I was assigned to be it was an electronics station, 1 million watt peak power in Okinawa on the north side of the island, which basically I had 25 board guys. We had commercial power. The aid had for the most part been automated, but the station was huge and required a lot of maintenance. And so my biggest challenge was to keep the men from getting too bored and getting into mischief. And if you know anything about men, when they're out alone in an isolated place, they will do anything they can to entertain themselves, like driving their motorcycles off cliffs and going to the local establishments, whatever it might be. So we made it a point to play sports every day and filled our time doing that. But yeah, that was an interesting tour. I was a commanding officer of the Loran station. I had really good food and chow, and because I did, I had an inspection and tours, and the adjutant general was coming in about every 3 or 4 weeks to inspect me. So the station was always well kept, and I had to really try out to always make sure that we didn't lose our edge. We had a couple other stations, 3 other stations in our chain. There was Hokkaido, Marcus Island, which is just a small rock out in the middle of the ocean, and Iwo Jima. And I would talk to these guys on HF quite often, and we would share and commiserate. And I realized I had the best luck of the draw to get Okinawa because I had shore power, I had commissaries, I had the Marines, I had the Air Force, I had a local village. It was just really, it was almost like out of a movie set. I had a coral reef and a beach. I was required to go into the village and teach English to the school children. So it was just really a special kind of opportunity to represent my nation and to have a crew.
Yeah. What kind of relationship was there between the civilian population and your people?
In Okinawa?
Yeah.
Remarkably good. As you probably know, the Marines in Okinawa, by virtue of who they are and the bases there, there has been some shame there on our military. But being a small station with located next to a small fishing village, there was really a tremendous amount of rapport I had with the village and the village elders. I would occasionally go to the base and buy a large bottle of cheap whiskey and deliver it to the village elders, and I made me a hero. I didn't have the heart to tell them it was $2 rot gut. But they were just gracious, thoughtful people. The Japanese, very disciplined, very polite, and I had the great opportunity to teach their children English in the village school. We played baseball with them. So there was no animus with us and the locals. I mean, there was a couple occasions, like my dog went into town and attacked one of the kids and they poisoned the dog. And the dog came up to the station and died, and my crew was going to riot the city, the village, and burn it down, which, as you know, I stopped. But for the most part, it was very, very amicable and just very gracious people. I have great respect for the Japanese.
Now, how long were you out there?
A little over a year.
Okay.
A year.
And did you go to Japan proper at all, or anywhere else in that area?
When I processed her, I spent a couple weeks in Honolulu on some training, meeting the staff, and then I flew on to Yokota, which is the Air Force base outside of Tokyo, which is where my headquarters for Japan was. We call it Far East Section Command, and that's where my command was in Yokota. I think I only went there a couple times, so I was kind of on my own, except when they wanted to get a good meal, they'd catch a flight and come down to see me in Okinawa.
All right. Now, were you married yet?
I got married and left a week later.
Okay.
So they always say, Jim, that the first year of your marriage is the worst. I wouldn't know. I wasn't around.
So what was your wife doing while you weren't there?
She stayed in Duluth, continued to work, and then, when I came home, it was kind of like starting all over again, and it worked out. But I won't deny that first year. It was before the time of the internet, and cell phones, and emails. It was still snail mail. It was a different time then, entirely.
Yeah.
I think we really forget about that. Yeah, there was a hardship there. And I often talk about this. Sometimes I think as veterans, we forget the hardships we put our families through and the people we love. As a veteran, we're in control because we're out there. We get to make decisions and we have some sense of control of our lives. But the loved ones we leave behind have no control. They're kind of passive, and they just have to kind of hope and pray that their loved one's okay wherever they are, whether it's on a ship or in the field or in combat. They don't know. So I've always been very cognizant of the fact that our loved ones behind play a very important role in the success of any veteran and his experience or her experience.
Yeah. Although I suppose in some ways this assignment was actually less dangerous than the one in Duluth, in the sense that you probably weren't going to sink.
Yeah. From that standpoint, in terms of opportunity for death and destruction. Having said that, though, it was a 1,000,000-watt peak power. On a humid day, you could hold up a fluorescent light bulb and it would blink. It would blink naturally because there was so much RF in the air. And in fact, subsequently, the Coast Guard has determined that Naval Station veterans have a higher incidence of cancer, and we're classified as atomic war veterans because of that.
Okay.
So if I come down with cancer, knock on wood, I would be classified as an atomic war veteran, be fully disabled, and I would get full treatment from the Veterans Administration. Fortunately, I don't have cancer yet.
Good. All right. So you have that assignment. What's next for you?
I went on to Seattle. I had a couple of tours, 2 years as a pollution officer on pollution response efforts out of Puget Sound. Then I did 2 years as a vessel traffic systems watch officer, where we control all the traffic coming and going out of Puget Sound and the Straits of Juan to Fuca. That was really a better tour because I really enjoyed the fact that it's basically air traffic control, but for ships. You have to understand that Puget Sound has ferries going east and west, and you have freighters going north and south. You have a lot of fishing activities, a lot of recreational activities. Lots of opportunities to have major collisions and accidents. We did have one major accident with the vessel Arco Anchorage, went aground in Puget Sound and Port Angeles, and had a significant oil spill that I was involved on to clean up. But that was just an enjoyable tour, mostly because I really liked working with the pilots, because part of our qualification we had to memorize 500 landmarks in Puget Sound and Strait of Juan to Fuca. So you really memorize the geography. You memorized everything you could, and the vessel traffic system had, I think, we had 10 radars and maybe 5 radio repeaters, and then I'd have all my watch standards in there. But the most enjoyable part I really liked was that we had to every month at least ride with the pilots at least once, where you would go out and ride the freighters coming in with the port pilots. As you can imagine, when a ship comes in the Strait of Juan to Fuca, large swells, you ride the pilot boat out, and they'd sit down the Jacob's ladder, and you time the swells, and the top of the swell, the first swell, you grab the Jacob's ladder and you pull it as hard as you can to make sure that they've secured it on the deck on the ship. And then at the top of the next swell, you jump onto the Jacob's ladder, and you better start scrambling, because you know that boat's going out from underneath you, and it's going to come right back up and smash you if you don't get up that Jacob's ladder and get on deck of the ship. So I really enjoyed that part of it. It was just kind of exciting to go out there in all kinds of weather and day and night and jump on a big freighter and ride it with really a professional pilot into port. Following that, 4 years in Seattle, I was asked to be, and this is kind of interesting, I was asked to, by the admiral staff in Seattle, downtown Seattle. I apparently had caught the eye of the admiral and the admiral staff. They had asked me to come up to be his, in the Army, which you call aide-de-camp, his liaison, carry his bags, and be his lieutenant, his O3 bag-carrying speechwriter, right?
Okay.
And I was asked to be the admiral's aide, and I looked at the chief of staff and I said, "No, thank you, sir," and he was stunned. He said, "What's the deal here, Lieutenant?" I said, "Well, Captain, I'm going to Alaska, and I'm going to be the XO on a buoy tender. That's my destiny." And he said, "You don't understand, Lieutenant. That's where we send lieutenants to lose their career, because it's so damn dangerous there." And of course, I thought, can't happen to me. I'm going to Alaska. That's my destiny, right? I'm going to make myself, you know. So I went to Alaska as an exec on a buoy tender there once again.
Okay. So had you put in basically a request to do that already?
Yeah.
So your assignment was coming up in Seattle. What do you do next? They wanted you to pull you in to be the admiral's aide, but you keep your original assignment. I want to go to
Alaska.
Okay. So
I get to Alaska, and I have a ship in Alaska out of Ketchikan. Wonderful, wonderful fishing port. They call it the first city. It's the rainiest city in North America. A lot of cruise ships go there, but they're only there in the 3 months of summer when the sun shines. The other 9 months of the year, it's just miserably cold, wet, and rainy. But from the standpoint of driving ships, it was exciting. It was a interesting and highly challenging assignment. As you can imagine, the inside passage with all the buoys and aids we had to work, not to mention that you have some significant tidal currents and tidal fluctuations. And by virtue of the fact of our mission, working in these really tight, restricted waters was very, very dangerous. And I think I communicated to you that we had a couple of really very, very bad instances that we nearly lost the ship. And that was a tremendous personal and professional challenge, because I sensed the safety of the ship and my obligation for the crew, balance that with my loyalty to the captain and to the mission. That was a real hard thing for me to process, because we were in harm's way much more than I liked and thought appropriate. We crossed the Gulf of Alaska in December 1989 in a significant major low. I was blessed not to ever get seasick, so I stood watches on the bridge. And on one of those bridge watches, as we transited across the Gulf of Alaska, we had winds over 90 knots and sea states of over 60. The ship was not seaworthy enough really to stand those kind of seas, although she was a well-built ship. We dove the ship more than once into the swell, and at one swell, The ship took water down the ship stack and flooded the engine room, and we nearly lost the ship. And that's still, I still live that moment every day when the ship went dead and we had water coming down the ship stack. Fortunately, our engineers were such, they were trained to restart the ship's engines, and we managed to dewater the ship and proceed on to Kodiak. The crew was very angry when we got to Kodiak because the captain was never visible during the whole transit. It was about a 4-day transit. And we didn't even really need to make the trip. It was a trip to join up with our other Coast Guard cutters and have basically a party. By virtue of another fact, they called it a roundup, but it was an opportunity to get the crews together and let them drink heavily, truthfully. The attitude towards drinking has changed a lot in the subsequent years, but the crew was very, very angry when we tied up in Kodiak, because we all knew we had kissed death and had not gone to the deep bottom. And I had to muster the crew and speak to the crew without the captain and reassure them that they were okay. They were God's gift, and we would live to see another day.
So where was the captain in all this?
In his stateroom, in his cabin.
Okay.
And incidentally, 3 months later, he put the ship on the rocks, and I had to relieve the captain as the ship was sinking, and we almost lost the ship once again. Here again, the ship was taking on water. We holed the ship. We had put a 70-foot gash down the side of the ship. We were driving a ship at night where we shouldn't have been. I was adamant not to be there, and the captain told me I was excitable and said, "Lieutenant Northrup, go below. XO, go below." And I laid below, Jim, and I just thought to myself, fuck the old man. If he wants to put his canoe on the rocks, I ain't going to be there. And you know what happened? It went bang, and the ship almost sank. We lost power. The ship was sideways in a very major channel at a max tidal current. When I got on the bridge, it was obviously darkened ship, no power, and we're sideways in the channel. The ship was on the verge of rolling over and sinking and killing the whole crew. We were that close. The captain checked out. He froze in his fear. And I can understand it. I'm not going to fault him for that. Fear is an unusual thing. It does things to people.
Sure.
But by virtue of the fact I was second in command, I subsequently had to relieve him, got power back, drove the ship to safe anchorage, did damage control, essentially saved the ship and got back into port about 3 days later.
Well, how did you get out of that? I mean, initial situation, because you described it at a point where the ship could have just rolled over right at that moment, and the captain wasn't doing anything.
When we didn't have power, the engines, so we're basically dead ship, dead in the water, or sideways, just a large ship in a small river current, half flooded. But the engine room did not flood. They got the engine back on line. They got the rudder back on line. I didn't know if I had a rudder. I sallied the rudder 5 degrees left, 5 degrees right. I could feel I still had a rudder, even though the ship was down by maybe 10 feet by the bow. The ship was totally awash forward. And then with some power, as you would expect, I had this part of our operational area fully memorized. I was very detailed, in particular, about understanding our operation area, and I didn't even need to look at a chart to understand where I had to drive the ship at that point. Even though she was half full of water, and we still had propulsion, and we drove into a safe anchorage and let go of the anchor and proceeded to do damage control. Subsequently, a few days later, when we pulled into port in Ketchikan, I met the admiral had sent an old weathered Coast Guard captain to meet the ship as the safety officer for the district, and he met the ship at the dock. At this point, I had basically already relieved the captain for cause, and when I met this old captain, he was very weathered. I don't even recall his name. I did call a lawyer before I spoke to him, but as you know, in a safety investigation, you can say anything and nothing will be held against you. So I told this old captain, I said, you can go back and you can tell the admiral, either he leaves the son of a bitch or I relieve my commission tomorrow. I don't really give a flying what it is, but it's got to end. Either I resign my commission or the captain's relieved for good. Now, I hadn't really thought this all out. because the next day there was a one-line telex message from the admiral saying Lieutenant Northrup is now the captain of Coast Guard cutter Plaintree.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I never sought to be the commanding officer of a ship with a big hole in it, damaged, a dispirited crew, as you can imagine, and a captain that had just been fired. But that was my destiny.
Mm-hmm.
My destiny was to be the captain of a ship at that point in my career, in my life.
Okay. I guess when you were in a channel, so there were not high seas there. You had a current, but not big waves.
Not big waves.
Okay.
Inside passage. Have you ever been to Alaska on a cruise ship? If you ever do, you'll understand it.
Mm-hmm.
The inside passage is just what you would call an archipelago
Right.
of rivers and islands and channels.
You're not out in open sea.
Very restricted water.
Okay. And then you said 70-foot gash. How long was the cutter?
180 feet.
Okay. That's
So
a long.
half the ship,
Yeah.
nearly half the ship was stripped open.
Ugh. All right.
Nobody was killed. Nobody was hurt.
Now
Except for a lot of egos and a lot of careers.
Okay. Now, how long did you wind up commanding that ship?
They brought in another captain about 2-3 months later.
Okay.
And I had to take the ship into the shipyard and get it dry docked, and had to do we had to get the repairs done to the ship.
So basically, you were in charge while it was in dry dock.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another
Yeah.
glamour assignment there.
Yeah.
Right. Did the crew's morale improve over time? And
Oh, they were angry.
Yeah.
Oh, they were violently angry. Come on now.
Yeah.
You can imagine.
But over time, once the captain's
Once
gone.
the captain was gone, it was a relief off all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And then, then I had to be a witness to, it wasn't a court martial. The reason we hadn't done a court martial was because it followed on the event of the grounding of the Exxon Valdez. We had just come back from 10 weeks on the Exxon Valdez cleanup. And there was a lot of egg on the Coast Guard and the federal government's face from the accident of the Exxon Valdez. So the district staff and the admiral chose not to court-martial the captain, but rather to hold it in a non-judicial punishment. And I had to be the primary witness, as you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still very angry about all this, by the way. It never quite leaves me. It's a point of humor sometimes, but it's still there.
But it was a serious business, and he could have gotten you all killed, and by doing something that was stupid in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean that's something that I encounter periodically in talking with military officers who find themselves in parallel situations. People's lives are at stake, and something happens there. Then to back up a little bit. So what do you recall about the Exxon Valdez part of your job? What were you doing at that time?
So I was the same ship. I was the exec, XO. It happened, the Exxon Valdez went aground on Thursday before Good Friday. I remember watching the message traffic come across our telexes talking about the grounding of the Exxon Valdez and the spillage, and I just assumed we would deploy right away. The district office had shut down already for the weekend, and it wasn't until subsequently the following Monday when everybody showed up at the district office and there was a big oh shit. Mm-hmm. When a ship has an accident, you have to first allow the owner and the carriers to assume responsibility, because the federal government does not want to federalize an accident, because if you do, then you assume responsibility. So over the weekend, the decision was made, and Exxon said, oh, we got this, we got this, we got this. Well, quite frankly, they didn't have it because it was a huge spill. So we didn't get underway until, I think, midday Monday, and then we got on scene. We were in Resurrection Bay outside of Seward, and we did cleanup operations for roughly, I think, about 7-8 weeks, working predominantly with fishing boats and some Russian trawlers that came along to help us do skimming operation. But the opportunity was lost once. I don't think people fully appreciate, once the accident happened, that ship was so close to blowing up and burning. It was only by the grace of God and a very competent engineering officer, because the captain was a Hazleton. He had 3 DUIs. He was a careless drunk, the captain of the Exxon Valdez. And the Coast Guard had some culpability in all this as far as I was concerned. We didn't have good resources on scene. It should have been a double-hulled tanker, but they had been given a waiver for a single hull. The captain was a notorious drunk and had several DUIs. So there was culpability, quite frankly, by the Coast Guard. But we were on scene. We did cleanup operation in Resurrection Bay. The opportunity really was already to get in front of a cleanup had already occurred, though, because after 4 or 5 days of crude oil being in the water, you really can't recover. You're just recovering tar balls. And most of those tar balls are already up on shore. You know, in the first 24 hours, you could have maybe burned it. You could have used dispersants. You could have had better booming activities and pumping, suction pumping early on. But by the 5th day, all that opportunity had been lost. And that attributed greatly to the tremendous environmental impact that spill had all across South Alaska. It was tragic, and they're still feeling the effects of that. One of my enduring memories is, there's two really from the trip. One is we ran out of cigarettes, and we had to barter with another ship to get cigarettes, and the only thing they sent over were menthols, which was the captain's brand. The other one was, I remember in Seward walking down the pier, and the Exxon had dispatched their accountants, and they were walking down the pier writing checks to boat owners for the value of their boats if they would sign a statement saying they would not sue. So they basically bought every boat they could in Seward Bay. And the fishermen were actually kind of happy because, you know, somebody came up and said, we'll pay off your mortgage.
Okay.
But, oh, and your livelihood? We don't know.
So were they buying the boats to use in the
No,
cleanup,
they
or
were
because
just
were
wanted,
damaged?
they just wanted to pay off their mortgages and make sure they signed a statement that they would not sue Exxon.
Oh, so they don't want people because they are fishermen to sue them, because you wipe out the fish, so you sue them.
So they
Okay.
just walk up and we'll pay off your boat.
Okay.
They bought a lot of boats, or they paid off a lot of mortgages for a lot of fishermen. I'm sure those fishermen went south for the rest of the year. That was an interesting event. I wouldn't want to do it again. I smelled enough crude oil in my days. I don't want to smell any more.
Yeah. What was the community in Ketchikan like?
Well, you know, Ketchikan was classified as the first city of Alaska. It's the first city as you're going north. It's in the bottom of the panhandle. It's a tourist town. I would liken it to Mackinac. It's just a lovely little fishing town. You know, my first child was born there. My wife was there. When I was around, it was a delightful place to live. It was just a neat place. But, you know, in the middle of winter, I got to go off to Hawaii for 3 months while I left my wife behind in Ketchikan, Alaska.
So why were you in Hawaii for 3 months?
We had deployed the ship once to Pearl Harbor for naval refresher training. Even though we were a small ship, we were still required to qualify for damage control and fire and basically extensive training operations where they keep the ship. At one point, the final exercise, you keep the ship going straight for 48 hours, no sleep, and drive the ship until the men just collapse to take you to that point of no return. And subsequent, you know, and actually that turned out to be very healthy for us because when the ship had an accident, we were fresh off coming out of Navy ref tray, and the crew was very trained to handle damage control in an accident with the ship. Because training, when it happens for real, you don't really distinguish this is not a training event. This is just kind of like a training event. You're just going to do it because you've been trained to it.
Right.
So that's why training becomes so critical, particularly in the military, because if you train to the event when the event happens, it's just like training, and you don't really process it, so to speak. So yeah, Hawaii was a great place to go in the middle of winter, and I think my wife's probably still holds it against me.
Now, does Ketchikan actually get a lot of snow in the winter? Or
No.
Does the water
It-
temperature keep it
well,
a little warmer?
You know, it's the water temperature is always going to be 32, 33 degrees, so you would get rain or snow, you know, wet snow. Ketchikan, the one year we were there, it rained 300 inches, which is nearly an inch a day. I always had to keep 2 pairs of shoes on the ship, boondockers, one above a heated duct trying to dry one out, while the other ones were usually getting wet when I was on the bridge. So from the standpoint of weather and environment, you have to understand that buoy tenders are the least glamorous of all ships the Coast Guard has, particularly if you're going to Alaska. So the junior officers that typically were, or even the enlisted men, the ones we got typically weren't the, what I would say, the top of the class. Because the top of the class, what ship are you going to pick? You're going to pick the high endurance cutter out of Key West. Hello?
Yeah.
Because why wouldn't you? So typically the officers and enlisted people I got were often, more often than not, towards the bottom of their class. And that presented a unique leadership challenge. I wouldn't say anything against them because they were all good guys, but they were maybe not they weren't the cream of the cream in terms of their assignment opportunities.
Okay. All right. So after that job, now what do you get?
Well, I was typecast in the Coast Guard because I had relieved a captain for cause, #1 Academy graduate. And I was a reserve regular officer now. Although my performance record was impeccable, the admiral wrote it, had to rewrite it because I failed promotion. He reassured me he had my back and he liked who I was and what I'd done and my courage under some significant events. But the promotion boards are a closed door affair. And most of the officers in the Coast Guard are academy officers, and they know everybody. And so at that point, I was a marked man. So I failed promotion, had to get out. I took a duty assignment on loan to the Army in Great Lakes as a staff officer, which quite frankly, I didn't really care for. Although there's one funny story there. That's right when Clinton became president. I worked for an old, crusty Army colonel, and I was the only Coast Guard officer on the staff. And when Clinton came to the White House, it was clear that the attitude about force structure and the policy concerning gays was going to change in the service. So I worked for an old colonel, and I had to write papers that we would submit. It was headquarters MEPCOM, which is the military processing command. So it was a joint command. And the message came down from the Assistant Secretary of Defense for us to write a position on gays in the military. So I told my colonel, he's an old codger, old Vietnam veteran. I said, Colonel, why do we really care if somebody's a homosexual in the service? If we don't ask them, they're not going to tell us. And he said, Lieutenant, that's the most goddamn idea I've ever heard in my career. Write it up, I'll send it up. So I wrote up this paper, basically saying, if we don't ask you, you don't need to tell us. And a week later, I came out of the Pentagon or out of the White House. Don't ask, don't tell. I'm not going to take credit for it, by the way. But stranger things had happened. So I don't know if I was the one that actually penned the idea or not. But it was just that's when the service was really in, I think, some significant transition from, well, for one thing, early on in my career, drugs and marijuana were a problem. And when your analysis came on board, it changed the services. And then there was an attitudinal shift, particularly in regards to smoking cigarettes and towards heavy drinking. And that was clearly a cultural shift across all the services. It's rare you find people in the service that even smoke cigarettes now. Alcohol and alcohol abuse and drunken behavior, at one time I would say was the standard, is now the exception. So the services have changed immensely in the last couple decades for the better. As a taxpayer, I think we get a much better value for a professional armed service that has some moderation in terms of some of their behavior.
Okay. You're also in the service during a period when women start doing more kinds of things. Did you have women on any of the staffs with the bases you were on?
Our OCS class we were a class of 27. I think we started with 36. We had one woman in our class, which was probably, I think, the second OCS class that had women. I think that was the year 1976, I think was the first year the Coast Guard was the last year at the Coast Guard Academy that did not have women graduate. In fact, I worked for a captain. His class ring said, LCWB was the initials on the class ring. And that's what the class agreed to. And they didn't tell the staff that that stood for last class with balls.
Lovely.
So all the academy graduates from the year of 1975 or 76, their class ring has LCWB. Now how vulgar and disrespectful is that? But that was reflective of the time about women in the service. On my OCS cruise on the Coast Guard cutter Unimac, when we sailed down in the Caribbean, we had one OC. She was commissioned. She eventually became a pilot. She was the one person and one female on board the ship. The crew obviously didn't care because in those days women were considered bad luck on ships. So I think most of us being younger, college educated, were maybe a little more thoughtful. We had to really look out for her. But one day on the mess deck underway, one of the crew members jumped up on to the mess deck table, dropped his trowels, pulled out his pecker, and danced it in her face. Now, there is maybe a little piece of humor in that, but predominantly it was disrespectful and highly vulgar, and nothing came of that event. Nobody was held accountable. Those were different times about attitudes, particularly in regards to women in the service. You can have a mixed emotion about that. Every time a Navy ship deploys with women, I think 7% of them come up pregnant and can't make the deployment. So it does affect military readiness and our force structure. We have to kind of maybe calculate that in, but we have to understand we're an inclusive service now. There are women serve across all branches and all responsibilities.
And there's plenty of jobs they're fully capable of doing. Well, when you had the assignments in Seattle, where you were shore-based a lot of the time, were there women enlisted personnel or officers there at those places?
Oh yeah, typically you had more women officers in those kind of administrative assignments. Maritime, Marine Safety Office inspectors. I would say maybe 20%, maybe.
Okay.
Not a lot. There were a few.
Was the climate for them better than it had been on that ship early on?
Well, of course, when you're in a large staff organization with lots of senior officers, there's going to be a little more thought and respect towards policy and regulation. I never recall any events of any of the females on my shore stations ever having any difficulties. Not that I was aware of anyway.
Was that assignment at Great Lakes, was that your last slot? All right. Are there other particular incidents or things that happened while you were serving with the Coast Guard that kind of stand out for you that you haven't brought into the story yet?
Well, I wanted to stay in. I always thought my destiny was to be the captain of a ship, not realizing that I had been the captain of a ship. It was hard when I got out. I loved the service. I liked the discipline. I liked the camaraderie. I loved the mission. I loved ships and big things. How can you not? It was just, even when it was bad, it was still exciting and good because I had an opportunity to be something bigger than yourself. I was uniquely privileged to have served my nation. And when people tell me, thank you for your service, I stop them short, Jim. And I say, don't thank me. I'm thanking you for giving me the privilege to have served my nation and served her proudly. And it was a unique privilege, and I was lucky to have been given that opportunity. So I am thanking you as a patriot for giving me that opportunity. And that turns it on people because it's not about me. My duty is about to my country and to my fellow patriots. So maybe that's a little bit of a different perspective than you quite often hear. My country owes me nothing but life, liberty, and the opportunity for pursuit of happiness. They don't owe me a check. They don't owe me anything. And from my perspective, maybe as John Kennedy said, ask not what you can do, your country can do for you, but what can I do for my country and to sustain this lovely republic of free market and enterprise that we are so privileged to be patriots and citizens of.
All right. Now, how do you think that your service sort of affected you or changed you, or what did you learn from it?
I think more than anything else, it hardens a person, certainly. And that also you have an understanding for your moral compass. And your moral compass has to swing north, irrespective of the outcomes. I had to deal with that more than once in my career, that it's not about me and my career or my life.
Mm-hmm.
It's about my duty to my crew and to my country. And when you go through that threshold, it changes you. It is a significant emotional event. And I think maybe that's why being a veteran is really a special category of our citizens. But here again, I was privileged. And I think that when you dig down into most veterans, they'll tell you the same thing, irrespective of the fact that they saw their friends maybe get killed and they had terrible assignments and they had terrible officers. At the end of the day, deep down, they are deeply proud and have tell you they were very privileged to serve their country.
That is something that I've observed, and even talking to Vietnam veterans who had a particularly bad time, on some level, they're still proud of something in there. Not all of them, but that's true for the World War II guys too. But okay, so now in this case, though, your career or your life's journey, it suddenly now changes, because now you're out of the Coast Guard.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're married, you have
Children.
kids. Okay, now what do you do?
Well, I got out when I was 37 years old. I was, industry wasn't really that interested in me because I was already old.
Mm-hmm.
So I basically started a civilian career all over at age 37. And quickly realized my leadership skills and ability to understand technical things easily transitioned to leadership in the manufacturing environment.
Mm-hmm.
So since 1994, I've been in manufacturing positions in predominantly automotive and electronics, leading large teams, because that being process-driven, being disciplined, appreciation for training, understanding highly technical, capital expensive equipment, running operations efficiently, that all translates right into a manufacturing environment. So from that standpoint, it was an easy fit.
Okay.
To transition into being I went to work for Motorola, building the analog flip phones. You probably
Mm-hmm.
remember those, built those by the millions. Motorola is a great company, and I've done fairly well in manufacturing. But here again, I started late in my civilian career, so to speak, because my military career was something I had to put behind me, take the uniform off and hang it up. It's only been in the last few years I've kind of maybe put it in some perspective. Sometimes I think the stories and the events I had lived through, I look back on that and it's almost like it was another person then, because it's in the past. And I think it's only been within recent years I've been able to put it in some perspective and maybe put a modicum of pride and realization that it was something really special. When I took the uniform off, I was very angry, very angry. I internalized a lot of that anger. And I think that's not an unusual thing. But you can't be a sorry sack sucker and feel sorry for yourself. You got to get on with your life. You have a family to raise. You have mortgages to pay. You have other opportunities in the world that require your talents. But I think most of us, when we leave the service, leave with a certain amount of disappointment, sorrow, because I think we all really liked it, and we liked being part of something bigger than ourselves.
And how did you wind up in West Michigan?
I was living in Texas. I had a great job. I was on the road. My wife informed me she was not happy. And I had a buddy up here working for an automotive manufacturing company that called me on a whim, who knew me from Motorola, and said, "Mark, you got to come up here. We need somebody with your drive and dedication and process discipline to join the team." So I came to West Michigan, and for the first time in my life, I actually lived in a place more than 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
So at my late 40s, I finally moved someplace and settled down, and finally maybe put up some roots in my life. Because you got to remember, I grew up in a military family.
Mm-hmm.
I was in the military myself. I took jobs in manufacturing that moved me around, and it wasn't until I got to West Michigan in 1990 or 2002
Mm-hmm.
that for once I settled down in my life. But life is opportunities. I've had a tremendous opportunity. In my journey, I never saw that I would get involved in government or politics, but by virtue of the fact of my maybe some of my abilities and experience. I was tapped to be a mayor of a small city in West Michigan that has been a great joy to be a mayor and to participate in some greatness again. That's a different kind of greatness. Politics is different than government, and government is different than industry. They all are unique in their own ways, but they all require a certain level of dedication and looking out for each other.
And in this case, you know, as sort of mayor of Hudsonville, you're looking at a place where there's a lot of change, there's a lot of growth, there's expansion and building, and so you've got a complex system to keep track of.
Yeah, but first of all, very careful. Don't let me take credit for any of that.
No. But it's going on, and someone has to be.
I am the mayor. We have a very, very good department heads and team. We have a city manager who was educated at Michigan State, is, my estimation, probably the finest city manager in the state of Michigan. As a mayor of the city, I chair the commission. That is a part-time job. My job is to be the voice for the commissioners, to get them all to agree to some levels. I get to appoint the boards and the committees. I hold the monthly city commission meetings. By the way, they're precise and organized, and there's no chit-chat. It's boom, boom, boom. That surprised you. And I think the team appreciates that. I always was a little bit, we have, like here, we have public access TV. We film all our city meetings. And I never have the residents show up to city meetings. And obviously, we work through some very controversial things, as you can imagine, particularly spending money to build a new downtown in the city. And I can only count the number of times on one hand in 4 years I've had anybody call me or show up at a city commission meeting. And for the longest time, I always thought, well, people are just really apathetic and they're too busy. But I've kind of transitioned, begun to come to understand that the people where we live just trust us because we're their neighbors. And as I often tell and give in a speech, these are the people we love. And that love is transparent. We have affection for the people we live with, our neighbors. We don't always agree, we know that. But we all have the best interest of the community at heart. I'm very fortunate. I have great commissioners. We're all very dedicated professionals and want to do what's right for the community and build a better place for our families. As evidenced by the fact, Hudsonville is the fastest growing community in West Michigan and has the finest and fastest growing school district in the state right now, which is unusual. We are at the right place at the right time. Our struggles are we don't have room in our schools. We need to get our roads and our transportation systems fixed. But from that end, we need to build more housing, because housing is a premium. We have full employment where we live. We can't find people to fill all these jobs we have. So from the standpoint of that, it's a challenge, but I'd rather have this challenge than to have a challenge like you maybe would have in Detroit or in Flint, where the city is in disrepair, there aren't jobs, people are leaving, you lose your tax base, your schools are closing. You know, it's a lot funner being on this side than that side.
All right. Well, the whole thing makes for a pretty good story, and you tell it well. So thank you very much for coming in and sharing it today.
More importantly, I think it's important that I acknowledge the fact of your passion for veterans and understanding, you know, our role in this great republic that we get to live in. So thank you, Jim, for your sincere interest and your historical reference point for what we bring to our country as veterans.